Hi folks, today I want to talk to you about how health economists set the price for new medicines. You might have heard in the news that healthcare systems in most countries around the world face rising budgetary constraints, while expenditures to fund new medical interventions for patients continue to go up and up. These limited budgets are the reason governments and national health services need to make trade-off decisions on which drugs to recommend. An easy way to think about such trade-off decisions in healthcare is what I like to call the two-bubble problem. In this example, the blue bubble represents the total cost of all medicines which have received regulatory approval and could therefore be used in patients. The yellow bubble on the other side represents the total budget that is made available by a government for national health services to reimburse all essential drugs that patients need. Now, given that the blue bubble is much larger than the yellow bubble, we can see why this creates a problem. Someone needs to decide which drugs to reimburse, as there is not enough money to cover all of these drugs. Therefore, most countries around the world have processes in place which are designed to address this exact decision problem. These processes are referred to as Health Technology Assessment, or HTA for short, and within HTA we can distinguish between two types of evaluations, which vary from country to country. The first type includes cost-effectiveness markets, in which cost-effectiveness models, or CEMs, are used to support decision-making. Typical examples of Type 1 HTA markets include the UK, Canada, or Australia. The second type includes non-cost-effectiveness markets, where cost-effectiveness assessment only plays a limited or supplementary role. The second type of HTA markets focuses more on clinical effectiveness and budget impact, and decisions are made based on non-public negotiations. Examples for these Type 2 HTA markets usually include Germany, Italy, or the US. In this video, I'm only going to focus on the first type of HTA markets, which are those markets that leverage cost effectiveness to make trade-off decisions on which medicines to recommend. So how can we evaluate cost effectiveness of new medicines? This is where health economists come into play, as they are the ones that build the cost effectiveness models, which are used to give an answer on the trade-off questions we've talked about earlier. There are many types of cost effectiveness models, like partition survival models, Markov models, decision tree models, or patient-level simulation models, but I won't go into detail here on how any of these models work. Only know for now that they all tend to use the same outcome, which is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or ICER for short. The ICER is calculated as shown in this formula, and what it does is it calculates the incremental differences in costs and effectiveness between a new drug and a comparator. C1 and E1 reflect the cost and effectiveness of the new drug, whereas C0 and E0 represent the cost and effectiveness of the comparator. Among the two variables used in the ICER calculation, the cost inputs are probably easier to understand. So let's start with those. Costs are simply a representation of any costs that are related to the treatment, such as treatment acquisition costs, adverse event costs, healthcare resource use costs, and so forth. So far, so good. But how can health economists measure effectiveness, you might ask? Aren't all diseases different and therefore have different effectiveness outcomes? And yes, that is true, but there's also a way around that problem. The way around that problem is to use the QALY outcome, which stands for Quality Adjusted Life Years. And the idea behind the QALY outcome is to combine the impact of gains in quality of life and quantity of life, and therefore have one outcome measure that can be compared across different disease areas, assuming that a wide range of aspects of quality of life is included in the quality component. To use slightly more technical language here for a second, I should say that QALYs are actually based on utilities, which are valuations of health-related quality of life measured on a scale where full health is valued as 1 and death as valued as 0. Let's look at this more visually using an example I've taken from a publication from Whitehead and Ali, which I will link to in the video description down below. As you can see in this example, we trace the health-related quality of life of two patients over time, whereby one patient receives a treatment while the other one doesn't. And since the treatment is very effective. The patient who receives the treatment does not only live longer, but also has a higher quality of life during the treatment. And through measuring the area under the curve for both patients, we can then derive their total QALYs and calculate the QALYs gained by taking the difference between the two areas under the curve. In this example, the QALYs gained from the treatment are represented in the area highlighted in green. Instead of looking at QALYs visually, we can also do this numerically. So for example, if someone experiences a health state with a utility of 0.8 for 10 years, and then a health state with a utility of 0.5 for 5 years, and then dies, their aggregated QALYs will be 0.8 times 10 plus 0.5 times 5, which equals 10.5 QALYs. Simple, right? What's more difficult is to estimate the health state utility that should be applied. So in our case, 0.8 and 0.5. Health economists use various methods for health state utility elicitation, whereby direct and indirect methods are usually distinguished. I won't go into detail on these methods in this video, but I'll leave a link to a tool in the video description which allows you to derive your own personal utility values, which is quite fun. Besides the utility value concept that we have just discussed, let me introduce another concept that we need to understand before we can proceed with calculating our ICER. The concept I am referring to is what's called discounting, which gets applied to both costs and QALYs. In essence, discounting is a concept used in health economics to account for how we value time. Think about it. If I were to offer you the choice of £100 today or £100 tomorrow, which option would you choose? Most rational people will choose the £100 today, given the implied uncertainty associated with waiting for the delayed payout. You could think that I might change my mind tomorrow about giving you the £100, which means that there is more risk involved for you with no additional benefit. The same also applies for health effects, even though the relationship is not as clear there. Generally though, the consensus is that health effects obtained today are worth more than health effects obtained tomorrow. I won't go into more detail on discounting in this video, but know that both costs and health effects are discounted when used to calculate the ICER, usually at a rate of 3.5%. Let us ignore discounting for now though, and instead focus on what we've learned about measuring quantity and quality of life to understand how QALYs come together with costs to calculate the ICER. For this purpose, I've created a hypothetical scenario in which a new drug costs £10,000 and generates 1.2 QALYs. This new treatment is compared against the standard treatment, which costs £5,000 and generates 1.1 QALYs. By comparing our new drug to the standard treatment, we can see that the incremental costs are £5,000, while our incremental QALYs are 0.1. We can plug these incremental results back into our formula to calculate the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, which gets us to an ICER of £50,000. However, this number alone doesn't tell us much. We first need to put it into the right context. In health economics, cost effectiveness results are generally compared in the context of a willingness to pay threshold, which is sometimes also referred to as the cost effectiveness threshold. This threshold thereby refers to the maximum amount of money an individual or society is willing to spend in order to acquire a health benefit, or to avoid a negative health outcome, or to gain additional years of life. In England, for example, the willingness to pay threshold set by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, called NICE for short, is a range between £20,000 and £30,000 per QALY. Looking at the upper £30,000 threshold, you might think, why 30,000? Why not 40,000 or 50,000? I mean, who cares? Let's make it 100,000, right? Over the many years, NICE has had this threshold in place. There's been heavy debate around what should be the appropriate threshold. Ultimately though, setting this threshold is a very fine balancing act, having to account for multiple factors such as innovation, healthcare budgets, and ethical considerations as well. It's easy to see how a threshold that is set too low, for example, let's say £5,000, would stifle innovation, as pharma companies would no longer have any financial incentive to bring new drugs to the market. On the other hand though, you can see how a willingness to pay threshold that is set too high increases the risks of flooding the market with products that only add very marginal benefits to the patients, given that the barrier to entry has been reduced so much, which could result in overspending on healthcare. Ultimately, the willingness to pay threshold is trying to answer the question of how much do we as a society value health, which I believe is a question that no one has found a definitive answer to yet. Coming back to our hypothetical example from before, let's take 30,000 as the upper limit of the NICE willingness to pay threshold and compare that against the ICER we've calculated earlier. What we can see is that our ICER, which is 50,000, is above this threshold. This means that the company would need to lower the price in order for their drug to be considered cost-effective at the £30,000 willingness to pay threshold. More specifically, any price equal to or less than £8,000 would cause a cost-effective outcome, assuming a £30,000 willingness to pay threshold. As I've mentioned earlier, health economists might have to consider multiple willingness to pay thresholds, which is why they sometimes also look at what's called the net monetary benefit outcome, in addition to the ICER. The net monetary benefit thereby shows the value of an intervention in monetary terms at a given willingness to pay threshold, which can be expressed using the formula here. In this formula, the little triangle or delta shows that the net monetary benefit considers incremental results. So delta E equals incremental effectiveness, while delta C equals incremental costs. This makes the interpretation of the net monetary benefit much easier compared to the ICER, as a positive net monetary benefit indicates that the intervention is cost effective at the specified willingness to pay threshold. If we use our incremental cost and effectiveness data from before, we can see that we get a negative net monetary benefit of minus 2,000. However, if we adjust our willingness to pay from 30 to 60,000, we get a positive net monetary benefit, indicating that our intervention is cost effective at the £60,000 willingness to pay threshold. While this example is of course very simplified, this is still basically what health economists would do to find a cost effective price for a new drug. They rely on a cost-effectiveness model to calculate the ICER or net monetary benefit, and depending on the result, they adjust the price to goal seek towards country-specific thresholds. Before I close out the video, let me recap what we've learned today. We've learned that in healthcare we need to make trade-off decisions, which means that we can't say yes to all new medicines that come to the market. We also learned that there are two types of HTA markets: those that focus on cost-effectiveness, which I've labeled type 1 markets, and those that don't. Also, I've talked about how health economists use cost-effectiveness models to calculate the ICER or net monetary benefit, which are used to set the price for new medicines in type 1 markets. I then explained how both the ICER and net monetary benefit concept use discounted inputs such as costs and QALYs, whereby QALYs have a quality and quantity component measured through time spent in a health state and the corresponding health state utilities. With that in mind, I talked about how in order to find a cost-effective price for a new medicine, we need to know a payer's willingness to pay threshold, which can vary from country to country. Lastly, I showed that if we use the ICER, it needs to be below the willingness to pay threshold to be considered cost effective, and health economists will go seek towards the right price to get to this point. If we use the net monetary benefit instead, a positive outcome shows us that our intervention is cost effective. And there you have it. This is how health economists set the price for new medicines. If you've liked this video and you want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing and hit the notification bell if you don't want to miss out on my latest videos. I'll cover a variety of topics, including basic health economic ideas like this one today, all from the perspective of a former consultant who's worked in the pharmaceutical industry for years. If that's what you're looking for here on YouTube, then you came to the right place, and I'll see you in the next video.